December 17th, 1944, 05:30 in the morning, Hansfeld, Belgium. The roar of the battlefield is replaced by a terrifying silence. The engine of the massive King Tiger tank coughs, sputters, and dies. SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Piper, the most feared commander in the Ardennes, slams his fist against the steel turret. He screams into the intercom. His driver, Unterscharführer Weber, tries to restart the beast. The 700-horsepower Maybach engine turns over and fails.
The gauge is empty, Herr Obersturmbannführer, Weber reports, panic rising in his voice. The reserve tank is dry. Piper climbs down into the frozen mud. Around him sits the most powerful armored force Germany has left. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, the elite of the 1st SS Panzer Division. They are not defeated. They are paralyzed. They are out of gas. But then, through the mist, Piper sees something. He walks toward the abandoned American supply depot at Hansfeld. The GIs fled so fast they left their coffee boiling on the stoves. And there, stacked in pyramids, is a gift from the god of war. Jerry cans. Thousands of them. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruel, pries one open and sniffs. He looks at Piper with wide eyes. Benzene, he whispers. High octane. It is a miracle. 50,000 gallons of American fuel. Enough to drive Piper's entire battle group all the way to the Meuse River. At Hansfeld, the Germans celebrated. They drank the American coffee. They poured the American gasoline into their thirsty tigers. But as Jochen Piper watched his men looting, a cold realization settled over him. It hit harder than a bullet. He realized that the Americans had abandoned this depot without a fight. They left behind more fuel in a single morning than a German panzer division received in 6 months. If the enemy could afford to throw away a fortune like this, how could Germany possibly win? Piper was seeing the reality on the ground. In Berlin, Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, was seeing it on paper. 6 months earlier, Speer had handed Hitler a report that should have ended the war. The Allied bombers had systematically murdered the German fuel industry. The massive synthetic plants at Leuna, Politz, and Bleckhammer were smoking ruins. Production had collapsed by 90%. The math was impossible. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Germany managed to scrape together just 33 million. The Third Reich was trying to fight a mechanized war with an empty tank. Major Friedrich Seemann, the logistics chief for the offensive, had warned Hitler. He calculated they needed 4.5 million gallons just to reach Antwerp. Hitler promised 5 million, but in reality, less than half was delivered. So the German High Command made a decision that was pure suicide. They ordered their tanks to advance and capture their fuel from the enemy along the way. They were betting the existence of the nation on armed robbery. The Americans were fighting a different war. They had built Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. They were pumping gas from England, under the sea, directly into France. By December, the U.S. Army was receiving 1.4 million gallons a day. They were burning 1.2. They were getting richer while they fought. Jochen Piper was not a fool. At 29 years old, this poster boy of the Waffen-SS was a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front. He knew that courage without gas was useless.
2 days before the attack, Piper sat in a briefing room at Tondorf. His commander, the legendary General Sepp Dietrich, looked him in the eye and gave him the order. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse River," Dietrich said, "if you capture American supplies along the way." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Piper did the math. He had 31,000 gallons of fuel.
That was enough for 50 miles of hard driving. The Meuse River was 65 miles away. The plan was mathematically impossible. As he prepared his Tiger tanks, Piper issued orders that reeked of desperation. "Drive single file to reduce friction," he commanded. "Capture American fuel dumps at all costs." And the most humiliating order of all: if a tank stops for more than 5 minutes, shut off the engine. The pride of the German army was being told to drive like they were running on fumes, because they were. The contrast was sickening. Just 20 miles away from the starving German tanks, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion opened his diary. He wrote a complaint. "Received 8,000 gallons of fuel today," he wrote. "Third delivery this week. Our storage tanks are already full." The Americans were drowning in gas. The Germans were dying for it. Then, at 05:30 on December 16th, the sky exploded. Operation Wacht am Rhein began with a massive artillery barrage. It looked terrifying. But as soon as Piper's tanks started their engines at 7 a.m., the plan fell apart. The roads of the Ardennes were narrow, icy trails. The massive Tiger tanks slipped and stalled. Traffic jams stretched for miles. Then they hit Lanzerath. Piper expected to roll over the defenders. Instead, he ran into 18 American kids, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. They dug in on a ridge and fought like demons. For 10 critical hours, 18 men held up the entire 1st SS Panzer Division. Piper was furious. But worse than the delay was the cost. For 10 hours, hundreds of German engines sat idling in the cold, burning fuel while going nowhere. When they finally broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn, the gauge told the story. They had traveled only 20 miles, but they had burned 40% of their fuel. Piper realized the math was killing him. At this rate, his tanks would become steel coffins long before they ever saw the Meuse River. The depot at Hansfeld was just a temporary dump, a Class 3B supply point. But to the starving Germans, it looked like El Dorado. Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruhl stared at the site. Pyramids of jerry cans, he later testified, stacked 3 meters high, stretching for 200 meters. The Americans hadn't even bothered to blow it up. The Germans frantically poured the fuel into their tanks. But there was a dark irony.
The American gas was high-octane, aviation grade. It was actually too good for the rough German engines. The Maybach motors, built to run on synthetic sludge, started to overheat on the rich American blend.
Then Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman found a piece of paper that changed everything. It was a shipping manifest. Hoffman read English. He traced the journey of the fuel they were stealing. It had come from Texas to New York, then to Liverpool, then to Normandy, and finally to Hansfeld. 6,000 miles in less than 6 weeks. Hoffman handed the paper to Jochen Piper. The colonel read it twice.
He realized that the Americans could ship fuel across the entire planet, faster than Germany could move it across the Rhine. Piper crumpled the paper. His face went pale. He didn't say a word. Then a private found a copy of the Stars and Stripes newspaper, dated 2 days earlier. The headline boasted about a new pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun. It was delivering 300,000 gallons a day. Piper realized the math.
A single American pipe was delivering more fuel every day than his entire army would use in the entire battle. To understand the German panic, you have to look at the home front. By late 1944, Germany was dying of thirst. The Allied bombers had strangled the supply. The Luftwaffe was grounded. The U-boats were hiding underwater, using snorkels to save diesel. In Berlin, gasoline was so precious that the Gestapo investigated the theft of a single liter. Farmers abandoned their tractors and went back to using horses. Meanwhile, the United States was pumping 67% of the world's oil. One single oil field in East Texas produced more petroleum than the entire German Empire combined. Standard Oil had so much crude, they didn't know what to do with it. Fueled by the stolen American gas, Piper surged forward to Bullingen. There, he captured something more dangerous than ammo. He captured maps. He opened them and stared in disbelief. The depot at Hansfeld wasn't a fluke. The maps showed American fuel dumps at every major crossroads. The U.S. First Army had 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Piper pushed on to Lingeville. The desperation made his men vicious. Near Malmedy, they slaughtered 84 American prisoners. Piper later claimed he didn't have the fuel to transport them to the rear. By the evening of December 17th, his spearhead reached the town of Stavelot. The scouts reported a massive prize. A main supply depot. Over 2 million gallons of fuel. It was right there. Enough to win the battle. At Stavelot, the trap was set. The depot held 2,189,000 gallons of fuel. It was stacked across 15 acres. To the Germans, this was a lifeline. To the Americans, it was bait. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineers didn't panic. He ordered his men to pour gasoline trails between the massive stacks of jerry cans. At 16:30, the first German tanks appeared. Technical Sergeant Paul Salas pulled the pin on a white phosphorus grenade and threw it. The result wasn't just an explosion. It was a volcano. A wall of fire shot 100 feet into the air. The heat was so intense, it melted the asphalt. Within minutes, 2 million gallons of gasoline were turning the sky black. Piper's tanks ground to a halt. The prize they had fought for was burning right in front of them. The fire was so massive it would burn for 3 days. Unterscharführer Weber, Piper's driver, watched his commander. Piper stood on the turret of his King Tiger, staring into the inferno. The flames illuminated his pale face. He stood there for 5 minutes, silent. Then he climbed down and whispered the truth. "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to keep it from us," Piper said. "What are we even doing here?" It was happening everywhere. At Trois-Ponts, the Americans burned 1.1 million gallons. At Spa, another 2.5 million went up in smoke. In 1 week, the U.S. Army deliberately destroyed 8 million gallons of fuel. That was more than the entire German allocation for the battle. They burned it because they knew. There was plenty more where that came from. While Piper watched the fuel burn, the American machine was pumping more. The logistics were staggering. Colonel James Snyder, the chief logistics officer for the U.S. First Army, opened his ledger on December 18th. He wrote down the numbers calmly. Fuel received yesterday, 1.8 million gallons. Fuel issued, 1.6 million. Net gain to reserves, 224,000 gallons. Even in the middle of a massive enemy attack, the Americans were gaining fuel. They had laid pipelines from Cherbourg all the way to Paris, pumping 800,000 gallons a day. It was a river of oil that never stopped. Meanwhile, Piper pushed deeper into Belgium, towards Stoumont. But his tanks were thirsty beasts. A King Tiger tank burned 2.5 gallons of fuel for every single mile.
In the mud and snow of the Ardennes, that consumption jumped by 40%. Hauptsturmführer Otto Dingler, the maintenance officer for Piper's regiment, did the math. It was the math of defeat. By noon on December 18th, Dingler recorded, we had burned 67,000 gallons since the start. We had captured only 55,000. They were operating at a deficit. Every mile they advanced, they were bleeding fuel faster than they could steal it. The Germans weren't just fighting the Americans. They were fighting the fuel gauge. The Americans were listening. Using the ultra-secret magic intercepts, General Courtney Hodges knew exactly what was happening inside the German tanks. He sent a ruthless order down the line. The enemy is starving. If you can't hold the fuel, burn it. While Piper scraped the bottom of the barrel, the sky above was filled with American C-47s. They were dropping supplies into the besieged city of Bastogne. In 1 day, they airdropped 160,000 gallons of gas to the 101st Airborne. Think about that. The Americans airdropped more fuel to a single surrounded town than Piper's entire army possessed. By December 19th at Stoumont, the German attack stalled, not because of resistance, but because the tanks simply stopped moving. Piper consolidated his remaining fuel. He had 8,000 gallons left. At the same moment, Allied planners in Paris were filling out a requisition form for January.
General Maurice Gilland requested 245 million gallons. The request was stamped approved without a second thought. Then the radio message arrived for Piper. It was the death knell. Fuel convoy destroyed by aircraft. No resupply possible. Piper called a meeting in a damp cellar. His tank commander, Sturmbannführer Werner Pochka, was blunt. "We have fuel for 20 kilometers," he said. "The Meuse River is 30 kilometers away." Piper looked at his men and spoke the final truth.
"Gentlemen," he said, "we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel just to spite us than our entire Reich can produce. We cannot win." The realization spread to the highest ranks. General Hasso von Montefel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, heard the reports of the burning depots. He wrote the epitaph for the offensive. "When I learned they burned 8 million gallons just to deny it to us,
I knew the operation had failed before it began." Colonel Friedrich von der Heide, a legendary paratrooper captured days later, told his American interrogators the simple truth. "Your soldiers throw away chocolate," he said. "My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure it by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" By December 21st, the trap snapped shut. Piper was surrounded in the village of La Glaise.
His mighty king tigers were turned into static pillboxes. They couldn't move. The American forces surrounding him had a fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons for that day alone. Piper had less than 1,000. An American private, Richard McKinney, wrote home about the absurdity of it. "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes that we use more fuel heating our coffee than they have for their tanks." Then, on December 23rd, the weather cleared.
The sky turned black with Allied planes. 2,000 bombers and fighters launched into the air. In a single day of operations, the Allied air forces burned more fuel than the entire German army had been allocated for the whole Battle of the Bulge. Christmas Eve, 1944. The end of the line. At 02 in the morning, Joachim Piper gave the order to retreat. Not in his tanks. On foot. He left behind 39 armored vehicles. They weren't broken. They were perfectly operational. They were simply thirsty. Obergefreiter Heinz Golds watched the final act of destruction. The crews drained the last drops of fuel from the entire column, barely 200 gallons in total. Then they used their remaining shells to blow up their own machines. Piper personally set the charges on his command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks of cutting-edge technology destroyed because they couldn't find a gas station. Out of 5,000 elite SS troops who started the mission, only 770 walked back to the German lines. They were frozen, defeated, and they carried a terrible secret. The Americans were unbeatable. When Field Marshal Walter Model read the report on December 26th, he stared at the numbers. 50,000 gallons captured, he read.
8 million gallons destroyed by the enemy. Model looked up at his staff and said quietly, "We are not fighting the same war."
But in the Führer bunker, Hitler refused to believe it. When Albert Speer showed him photos of the burning depot at Stavelot, Hitler screamed that it was fake. He claimed it was Hollywood special effects. But the common soldier knew better. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote a letter to his wife that passed the censors by mistake. "The Americans destroy more fuel in a day than we receive in a month," he wrote. "They drive tanks like we march."
This war is lost. The empty tanks in the Ardennes were just a symptom. The disease was industrial. By 1944, the United States was producing 50% of the world's manufactured goods. They launched a new ship every day, a new tank every 7 minutes, a new plane every 5 minutes. But the oil statistics were the most damning. In 1944, the U.S. pumped 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Germany managed a pathetic 33 million. The entire Axis alliance produced less than 2% of American petroleum. On December 27th, Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a moment of dark comedy in the American HQ. A worried logistics officer reported that a blizzard had slowed down supply trucks. "We are only receiving 500,000 gallons a day," he complained. The room went silent. They realized that their shortage was larger than the entire German supply for the whole offensive. For the German prisoners, this abundance was a psychological weapon. They saw GIs washing their greasy uniforms in buckets of gasoline, wasting a commodity that German generals would kill for. They saw soldiers heating their coffee with burning petrol. Oberst Georg Reichel told his interrogators, "We knew the numbers on paper, but seeing your soldiers waste more than we possessed, that made it real." Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote a letter home that summed up the despair of the Wehrmacht. The Americans wash clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery just to celebrate Christmas. We cannot fight infinity. The end of the Aryan myth didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened in the ledger. At the Nuremberg trials, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel admitted the humiliating truth. By 1944, he testified, "We couldn't move." The Americans moved armies like chess pieces. We were paralyzed. Jochen Piper, on trial for the Malmedy massacre, claimed his war crimes were driven by the gauge. "Every decision," Piper said, "was dictated by fuel. We couldn't maneuver. We couldn't retreat. We counted liters while the Americans drove freely." The industrial disparity was grotesque. For every barrel of oil Germany produced, the Allies produced 50. For every German tank, there were 2 Americans. For every German plane, 3 Allied bombers. On Christmas Eve, as Piper's men escaped on foot through the snow, leaving their mighty king tigers behind. The realization set in. Unterscharführer Weber looked back at the Hansfeld depot. That morning, he recalled years later, we thought capturing 50,000 gallons was winning the lottery. By evening, we realized it was nothing. 50,000 gallons was less than a single American armored division used in 2 days. It was a rounding error.
Major General J. Lawton Collins, the American Corps commander, wrote the final verdict on the German strategy. They assumed we valued fuel as they did, Collins wrote, as something precious. They couldn't comprehend that we had so much. We would rather burn millions of gallons than let them have a drop. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't decided by strategy. It was decided by immutable mathematics. When the smoke cleared, the historians ran the numbers.
During the offensive, the entire German army consumed 2.8 million gallons of fuel. During the same period, the American forces burned 267 million gallons. The Allies used 100 times more gas than the Germans. It was like fighting a forest fire with a water pistol. Every German soldier who saw this abundance realized the truth. They weren't fighting a war anymore. They were participating in their own execution. Jochen Piper survived the war.
He spent 11 years in prison for his war crimes. He was released in 1956 and moved to France, trying to hide from his past. But in 1976, his past caught up with him. He was murdered, his house firebombed by unknown assailants. But before he died, he gave an interview that revealed his true nightmare. He admitted that capturing the American fuel at Hansfeld wasn't a victory. It was a curse.
Finding that depot was the worst thing that could have happened, Piper said. If we had run out of gas earlier, we might have retreated with dignity. Instead, he concluded, we discovered that the Americans had oceans of fuel, while we had drops. We discovered the impossibility of victory. The lesson of the Ardennes is simple. Production beats courage. Military historian Colonel Trevor Dupuy calculated the brutal math.
In December 1944, every single American soldier was supported by 67 pounds of supplies every day. The average German soldier, he received 3 pounds. 40 years later, in 1984, the ghosts of the battle met again. They gathered at the museum in Le Glaise, Belgium. Outside, one of Piper's king tigers still stands guard. It sits exactly where it stopped in 1944. Former Unterscharführer Karl Wortmann stood next to the steel monster.
Beside him was former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the U.S. 30th Division. Anderson looked at the German and asked the question that had puzzled him for decades. "We always wondered why you stopped," Anderson said. "We thought it was a tactical trap." Wortmann laughed bitterly. "We didn't stop for tactics," he said. "We stopped because the tanks were empty. You burned millions of gallons just to keep it from us. How could we fight that?"
Anderson went quiet. Then he admitted the ultimate truth of the American war effort. "We never knew you were that short," the American said. "We had so much gas. was simply never thought about it. That exchange captured the entire war. One side was fighting for every drop. The other side had forgotten that fuel was even a finite resource. It wasn't just quantity. It was quality. The American refineries produced 100-octane aviation fuel loaded with tetraethyl lead. It was liquid power. The Germans were running on 87-octane synthetic sludge. When German mechanics poured captured American gas into their trucks, the engines often overheated and failed. The fuel was too rich for their machines. But the true horror was in the rear. Oberarzt Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting, a German military surgeon, testified to the human cost of the shortage. "We had excellent surgeons," he said. "We had captured American bandages, but we had no fuel for the ambulances. Men bled to death because we couldn't drive them 10 kilometers to the hospital." By February 1945, the end came. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the elite Panzer Lehr Division, looked at his force. He had 42 operational tanks. He had experienced crews. He had ammunition. But he had only 300 liters of fuel. "It wasn't enough to reach the next town," Bayerlein said. "So we blew up our own tanks and walked into captivity." Today, in the small Belgian village of La Glaise, a King Tiger tank still sits in the town square. It is the very tank Piper abandoned. It is a monument, not to tactical brilliance, but to reality. It sits there, menacing and powerful, with its 88mm gun pointing at the hills. But its fuel gauge reads empty. History remembers the battles. But the war was decided by the tanker trucks. Germany fought the impossible, measuring their defeat in liters, while America measured its victory in oceans.